What's up, y'all? It's GC Kinsey, here to tackle a question I see a lot about sex-favorable and sexually active aces. If you're asexual, is it possible to give enthusiastic consent? Just to make sure we're all going into this with the same context, I want to start with a few definitions. First is asexuality, an orientation that describes those who experience little to no sexual attraction to other people. Asexual can be an umbrella term for anyone who falls on this spectrum of little to no attraction, or a more specific term for those who experience zero sexual attraction. Gray asexual is a term for those who experience little sexual attraction, perhaps very rarely or only under specific circumstances, or who aren't really sure what sexual attraction is. Asexuality is different from low libido or celibacy or a whole bunch of other things it gets mixed up with, which I've covered in more detail here. But for now, I want to focus on mix-ups between asexuality and sex favorability, which is our second definition. Sex favorability is a scale that describes how people feel about sex, whether that's engaging in sexual activity with others, engaging in sexual activity with yourself, consuming sexual media, talking about sex, what have you. This scale is divided into three main categories. Sex favorable, meaning you enjoy sex or you're open to the idea of it. Sex indifferent, meaning you can take it or leave it. And sex repulsed, meaning you find sex off-putting and don't want anything to do with it. One thing I want to emphasize here is the difference between sex favorability and sex positivity. When we use the terms sex positive and sex negative, we're talking about how you feel about sex for everyone in the general population. Whereas when we use the terms sex favorable, sex indifferent, and sex repulsed, we're talking about how you feel about sex personally for yourself. So a sex positive person might say that everyone should do whatever they want sexually as long as it only involves consenting adults and doesn't harm anyone. A sex negative person might say that sex is bad and people shouldn't be having it, except perhaps in the morally correct way, aka with your spouse for the purpose of procreation. That's very different from a sex favorable person saying I like sex and a sex repulsed person saying I don't. The sex favorability scale doesn't involve any sort of judgment toward other people, it's only about your own personal feelings. And finally, our third definition is, of course, enthusiastic consent. In the most general sense, consent means that you agree to do something. So when you think about that in a partnered sexual context, consent means that you've agreed to engage in sexual activity with someone. But over time, as our understanding of both consent and sexual relations has evolved, we've been able to spot some consent loopholes that might be exploited during sexual encounters. For example, if someone has agreed to have sex but they were pressured into it, did they truly give consent? If someone agrees to have sex but they're under the influence of alcohol or other substances, can they truly give consent? If someone agrees to have sex under certain circumstances, like with a condom, and those circumstances aren't met, like if their partner slips the condom off when they're not paying attention, was their consent violated? If someone initially agrees to have sex and then changes their mind once the sex gets underway, does their partner violate their consent if they don't stop? Does marrying someone mean you're giving them blanket consent to any sexual activity at any time, etc.? Out of those kinds of concerns arose the idea of enthusiastic consent. Consent that's given freely without any sort of pressure or manipulation. It's not merely agreeing to do something, it's wanting to do it. It's the difference between saying yes versus not saying no. So now that you have all that context, let's talk about enthusiastic consent and sex-favorable asexuals. A lot of people outside the ace community don't even realize that sex-favorable aces exist. They think it's impossible for an asexual person to engage in any sort of sexual behavior, or that if they do, they must not really be ace. But within the ace community, we know better, right? Because we understand the difference between a lack of sexual attraction versus sex repulsion, and we know that action is not attraction. So it makes perfect sense to us that you can be asexual and still be open to having sex. But I see this question crop up every so often in ace community spaces and discussions online, which is, can an asexual person give enthusiastic consent to sex? And I want to tackle that question in a way that will hopefully get y'all thinking about it with a little more depth and nuance. So first and foremost, my answer is yes, aces are 100% capable of giving enthusiastic consent to sex. And I think that's true regardless of sex favorability. A sex-indifferent ace is just as capable of consenting as a sex-favorable ace. And even though a sex-repulsed ace is much less likely to do so, they still have agency and they still can. Now I'm going to dig deeper into this question from 3 different angles, and hopefully from that you'll get a better understanding of why my answer is yes. The first angle I want to discuss is the framing of the question itself. Because when you ask, can aces give enthusiastic consent? Is it even possible? What that seems to be getting at is, if you're not sexually attracted to anyone, how can you be enthusiastic enough about sex to consent to it? And I think framing the question that way shows a lack of understanding of how sexual attraction relates to sexual activity, and how enthusiasm relates to enthusiastic consent. Sexual attraction is not a requirement for consensual sexual activity. You can want sex with someone for all kinds of reasons that have nothing to do with sexual attraction. Maybe you're attracted to them in other ways, like romantically or aesthetically. Maybe you're curious about having sex with them and think it might be fun. Maybe you're just there for the physical sensations. Maybe you know that sex would make your partner happy and making them happy makes you happy. There are plenty of other possible reasons, and there's no right or wrong reason to want sex. And when it comes to the enthusiasm aspect, in the context of consent, enthusiastic doesn't mean you're just chomping at the bit with excitement ready to go. It doesn't mean that you're so attracted to the other person that you're just dying to jump their bones. All it means is that you're doing this because you want to. Not because of pressure, not because of expectations, but because of your own personal reasons. For aces, sexual attraction isn't usually one of those reasons, and that's totally fine. And that doesn't just apply to aces, by the way. It can also apply to allosexual sex workers who aren't attracted to their clients, allosexual people who are having experimental sex to explore their orientations, etc. So when I answer this question of can aces give enthusiastic consent to sex with yes, that's one of the ways I back it up, by explaining how you can enthusiastically consent to sexual activity without feeling sexual attraction. The second angle I want to discuss is the purpose of the question. Are people asking whether aces can give enthusiastic consent to sex out of concern for aces who may face consent violations, or is it more concern trolling? Because I think that makes a big difference in how to approach the answer. It is absolutely true that aces face consent violations in sexual situations, disproportionately so. For a long time, we've had anecdotal evidence of aces being subjected to corrective rape, and the ACE community survey has captured more specific data around this in recent years as well. I've linked to that information in the description. Even the classic, you just haven't met the right person yet, that so many aces hear when we come out is rooted in corrective rape, in the idea that having sex with the right person will fix us. And there are sleazy jerks out there who even try to use the existence of sex-favorable aces to justify that mindset. Some aces have sex, why can't you? I bet I could make you enjoy it. That sort of thing. So I totally understand why some people might ask whether aces can give enthusiastic consent out of genuine concern. And in that case, I think a good approach to the answer is a reminder that just because aces may face consent violations in higher numbers doesn't mean we can't consent to sex. So then what about people who ask this question in a concern trolling way? How do you spot that, and how do you respond? I like to look at the context clues. If someone is asking this question to promote sex-negative attitudes, then it's probably concern trolling. For example, can aces even consent to sex? If not, why do we have so many sex scenes on TV? That's like shoving it in their face every time they try to watch a show. Sex scenes should just be banned. That would benefit everyone, not just aces. Who even wants to see that? The truth is, aces are just as capable as anyone else of choosing what we want to watch, and changing the channel if we get unpleasantly surprised. Similarly, if someone is asking this question to infantilize aces, then it's probably concern trolling. For example, can aces give enthusiastic consent? If not, then why are they even on dating sites? That's so dangerous for them. We should just take aces out of the dating pool for their own sake and everybody else's. That way they don't have to pretend to consent to anything, and we don't risk getting stuck with partners who think we're horny monsters. The truth is, aces are just as capable as any other adult of communicating what we want out of an adult relationship. We don't need to be treated like babies for our own protection. So when I see those kinds of context clues that point to concern trolling, I find it most effective to dismantle the sex negative or infantilizing logic first, and then explain how aces are capable of giving enthusiastic consent. The third and final angle I want to discuss is who is asking this question and why. And the reason that matters is because it determines what kind of supporting information will be most effective in explaining the answer. If an allosexual person is asking this question, are they asking it out of pure ignorance and looking to learn more? Then they likely need some general education about asexuality as part of the answer. Are they asking it because they've started dating an asexual person and they want to make sure they don't violate their partner's consent? Then they might do better with an answer that's tailored to their specific situation. If an asexual person is asking this question, where are they on their asexual journey and how involved are they in ace community spaces? Because a baby ace who's just come out and is very new in ace community spaces may need almost as much education and guidance as an allosexual person. And they may need some reassurance about how their orientation doesn't mean they can't give enthusiastic consent. Also, why are they asking this question? Is it because they're exploring their own sex favorability? Is it because they have a partner who wants to have sex with them? Is it because they're getting conflicting messages about consent from those around them and therefore having self-doubt? Knowing that context is the key to providing the best answer for that particular asexual person. This is also a good place to note that even though I think the general answer to can aces give enthusiastic consent to sex is yes, individual aces might answer that question differently for themselves. And if an ace person says, I don't feel like I can consent to sex without sexual attraction, or personally I'm too sex repulsed to consent to sex, then their feelings deserve to be respected. So after looking at this question about asexuality and enthusiastic consent from these three different angles, now is where I want to turn the conversation over to you. How do you tackle this question when you encounter it? If you're ace, how do you feel that your orientation impacts the way you give consent in sexual situations? Do you think there's a more ace-inclusive term besides enthusiastic to describe willfully given consent free of pressure? And whether you're ace or not, what questions do you have about all this? Drop a comment below and let's get a discussion going. You can also reach out to me on other social media. I'm GC Kinsey across all platforms. And while you're here, feel free to check out some of my other videos. I've got more vlogs like this one about my experiences as a queer person, along with cosplay music videos, makeup tutorials, a bunch of cool resources for singers about voice changes on testosterone, and more right here on this channel. So make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss anything new. And with that, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your support. I hope this gave you something to think about, and I will see you on the next one.